In the twilight depths of Faron Woods, where ancient shadows dance between towering trees, a golden wolf emerges from the mist. Its form shimmers like captured sunlight, yet its single red eye burns with otherworldly purpose. When this spectral beast lunges forward, jaws snapping shut around a hero's head, reality dissolves into something far more mysterious. The wolf's true form stands revealed, a skeletal warrior clad in tarnished golden armor, bearing the weight of forgotten ages. This is the hero's Shade, one of Hyrule's most enigmatic figures, a being whose tragic story spans centuries of sacrifice, regret, and undying devotion to heroism itself. In the annals of Hyrule's history, few moments carry the weight of the hero of Time's return to his childhood. When young Link emerged from the Temple of Time, having sealed Ganondorf and saved the kingdom from 7 years of darkness, his victory came with an impossible choice. Princess Zelda, recognizing the profound injustice of a stolen childhood, used her power to send the hero back to his youth, creating what scholars would later understand as the Child Timeline, a branch of reality where Ganondorf's reign of terror never occurred. This act of temporal manipulation held consequences that rippled far beyond its immediate mercy. The adult Link's heroic deeds, his battles through the forest, fire, and water temples, his courage in facing the King of Evil himself, were erased from this new timeline's history. Yet they were not forgotten entirely. The wisdom gained through that erased future remained with the young hero of time, along with something far more precious: knowledge of Ganondorf's true nature and impending betrayal. Armed with this foreknowledge, Link approached Princess Zelda with warnings that must have seemed impossible to believe. A young boy from the forest, speaking of time travel and alternate futures, claiming that the king of the Gerudo harbored ambitions of conquest and possession of the complete Triforce. Yet something in his manner, perhaps the weight of experiences that showed in eyes too old for his young face, convinced the princess of his sincerity. The prevention of Ganondorf's rise marked a fundamental shift in Hyrule's destiny. Instead of 7 years of corruption and suffering, the Gerudo king found himself exposed and captured, his plans unraveling before they could take root. The execution that followed ensured that this timeline's Hyrule would know peace, but it also meant that the hero of Time's greatest victory would exist only in his own memories and the grateful acknowledgement of the royal family. This creates a fascinating paradox in the nature of heroic legacy. While the common people of Hyrule lived in blissful ignorance of the catastrophe that had been prevented, those closest to power understood the magnitude of what had transpired. The hero of time had saved not just the kingdom, but the very flow of history itself. Yet this salvation came at the cost of recognition, creating a legend known only to a precious few. The royal family's reverence for the hero of time manifested in the preservation of his legacy through sacred relics. The green tunic that would later be granted to the hero of twilight by the light spirit, Faron carried with it the essence of divine selection. As Faron himself proclaimed, this garment had been worn by an ancient hero chosen by the gods, and his power slept within the fabric itself. This wasn't mere ceremonial clothing, but a conduit for heroic destiny. Similarly, the hero's bow found its way into the protective custody of the Gorons, who guarded it for generations as a treasure once belonging to the legendary hero. The fact that multiple races across Hyrule maintained these artifacts speaks to a coordinated effort to preserve the hero of time's memory, ensuring that future generations would have access to the tools and symbols of heroism when the need arose again. But perhaps the most telling artifact of all was the Master Sword scabbard, worn and decayed with age, that would later be witnessed in the possession of the hero's shade. This detail provides irrefutable evidence of the spirit's true identity, while raising intriguing questions about the hero of Time's later adventures. In the child timeline, Link never wielded the Master Sword as an adult, yet the presence of this scabbard suggests a return to the sacred blade at some point in his life. The connection between the hero of Time and his spectral successor reveals itself most clearly through the ancient melodies that summon the hero's shade. Each howling stone across Hyrule resonates with songs from the hero of Time's adventures. Zelda's lullaby, which opened so many doors and revealed so many secrets. Epona's song, which called his beloved horse across the fields of Hyrule. The prelude of Light, which connected him to the sacred Temple of Time. And the Requiem of Spirit, learned in the depths of the desert Colossus. Most significant among these melodies is the Song of Healing, a tune learned from the enigmatic Happy Mask Salesman during the hero of Time's journey through Termina. This melody, described as one that heals evil magic and troubled spirits, holds deeply personal significance. It represents not just magical power, but emotional restoration, the ability to ease suffering and bring peace to tormented souls. That this song appears among the hero's shade's howled melodies suggests a profound connection to the spirit's own troubled state. The Song of Healing's presence in the hero's shade's repertoire also hints at the continuing influence of the Termina adventure on the hero of Time's spiritual development. That strange, dream-like world where time reset every 3 days, where transformation masks granted new forms and abilities, where the boundaries between life and death proved remarkably fluid. These experiences would have profoundly shaped the hero's understanding of existence itself. When we consider the hero's shade's ultimate fate, trapped between life and death by unfulfilled purpose, the significance of carrying the Song of Healing becomes even more poignant. Perhaps in those centuries of waiting, he sang this melody to himself, seeking the peace that would only come when his knowledge had been properly transmitted to his descendant. The establishment of the hero of Time's legacy in the child timeline represents a careful balance between recognition and secrecy. While his deeds in the alternate adult timeline remained known only to a select few, his actions in preventing Ganondorf's rise and his subsequent adventure in Termina created a different kind of legend. This was a hero who crept away from the land that had made him a legend, as described in Majora's Mask's introduction, yet whose memory was held dearly by those who understood the true scope of his sacrifices. This recognition would prove crucial for future generations. When twilight fell upon Hyrule centuries later, the kingdom possessed not just the physical artifacts of heroism, but the spiritual framework for recognizing and nurturing the next incarnation of the hero. The green tunic, the sacred bow, the ancient songs, all served as tests and tools for identifying the one who would carry on the tradition of heroism. Yet for all this careful preservation of legacy, something remained incomplete. The hero of Time had accumulated a lifetime of combat wisdom, techniques refined through facing every manner of enemy and obstacle. This knowledge, so crucial for any future hero's success, had no clear method of transmission. Sacred relics could be stored and guarded, but the subtle art of swordplay, The instinctive responses that meant the difference between victory and defeat, these required direct instruction from master to student. This unfulfilled duty would prove to be the anchor that prevented the hero of time's spirit from finding peace in death. Despite the recognition of the royal family, despite the preservation of his artifacts, despite the honor accorded his memory, one crucial element remained undone. The techniques that had allowed him to triumph against impossible odds, the fighting wisdom that represented the distillation of multiple adventures and countless battles. This knowledge died with him, unavailable to future heroes who would face similar challenges. In the spiritual realm, where the hero's shade would later manifest, surrounded by ghostly echoes of Hyrule's most significant landmarks, the weight of this incomplete legacy became a binding force stronger than death itself. The hero who had conquered time would find himself conquered by duty, unable to rest until he had fulfilled this final obligation to the future of Hyrule. The child timeline's preservation of the hero of time's memory thus becomes both blessing and curse. The recognition ensured that his legacy would inspire future generations, but the incomplete nature of that legacy, the missing piece of practical knowledge, created a spiritual debt that would define his existence for centuries to come. In seeking to honor his memory, Hyrule had inadvertently created the conditions for his restless afterlife, setting the stage for a tragedy that would span generations. When the hero of time departed Termina for the final time, riding Epona through the swirling portal that connected that strange world to the lost woods of Hyrule, he carried with him experiences that would forever change his understanding of heroism, sacrifice, and the nature of existence itself. The boy who had once awakened in Kokiri Forest with nothing but a wooden sword and shield had become something far more complex. A warrior who had witnessed the malleability of time, the power of transformation, and the delicate balance between salvation and damnation. The years that followed his return from Termina remain shrouded in mystery, yet certain truths can be discerned from the evidence left behind. The hero of time did not simply fade into obscurity upon completing his adventures. Instead, he embarked upon the most human chapter of his extraordinary life. Unlike his previous quests, driven by destiny and divine mandate, this period would be defined by personal choices, relationships, and the gradual transition from active hero to living legend. The question of marriage and family lineage presents one of the most intriguing mysteries in the hero of time's later years. For the hero of Twilight to be his direct descendant, as confirmed by their shared bloodline and the hero's shade's paternal references, the hero of time must have established a family and raised children. This transformation from solitary adventurer to patriarch represents a profound shift in his life's focus, yet it speaks to the natural human desire for connection and continuity that even legendary heroes cannot escape. Various theories have emerged regarding the identity of the hero, of time's eventual wife, though none can be confirmed through historical records. Some scholars point to Malon, the spirited ranch girl whose father Talon had jokingly suggested she might marry the fairy boy someday. Their shared connection through Epona, the horse that had been entrusted to Link's care, certainly provided a foundation for continued contact. Malon's warm, grounded nature could have offered the stability and normalcy that a hero might crave after years of supernatural adventures and world-shaking responsibilities. Others speculate about Princess Zelda herself, though this theory faces significant obstacles. The complex relationship between Link and Zelda in the child timeline, where she retained memories of his future heroism while he bore the knowledge of an erased timeline, would have created unusual emotional dynamics. Additionally, royal marriages typically served political purposes that might not align with choosing a husband based purely on heroic merit, regardless of his legendary status. The possibility remains that the hero of time found love with someone entirely outside the scope of his documented adventures. After all, his later years encompassed decades of life that remain unchronicled. He might have encountered his future wife during travels to distant lands, or perhaps found companionship with someone from his own adoptive home in Kokiri Forest, though the ageless nature of the forest's inhabitants would present its own complications. Regardless of the specific identity of his partner, the establishment of the hero of Time's family line represents a crucial development in Hyrule's heroic legacy. The bloodline that would eventually produce the hero of Twilight carried with it more than genetic inheritance. It transmitted a spiritual connection to courage, duty, and the divine forces that shaped the kingdom's destiny. This hereditary link explains not only the physical similarities between the two heroes, their left-handed sword work, their ability to transform into wolves, but also their shared instinctive understanding of heroic responsibility. The most compelling evidence for the hero of Time's continued adventures after Termina lies in his possession of the Master Sword scabbard, witnessed centuries later during his manifestation as the hero's shade. In the child timeline, young Link never drew the Master Sword from its pedestal. That honor belonged only to his adult counterpart in the erased timeline. Yet the presence of this sacred scabbard, worn and ancient, suggests that at some point in his later years, the hero of time returned to claim the blade that had been meant for him. This reclaiming of the Master Sword would not have been undertaken lightly. The blade that seals the darkness responds only to those pure of heart and proven in courage, and its removal from the Temple of Time would have required both divine approval and urgent necessity. The most logical explanation lies in the emergence of a new threat to Hyrule, one significant enough to require the intervention of the kingdom's greatest hero and the employment of its most sacred weapon. Historical records from this period remain frustratingly sparse, yet certain clues suggest that the hero of Time's most renowned adventure may have occurred during these undocumented years. The widespread recognition of the ancient hero mentioned throughout Twilight Princess, known not just to the royal family, but celebrated by common folk, Gorons, and other races across the kingdom, indicates a level of fame that surpassed his earlier, more secretive exploits. This later adventure would have unfolded differently from his previous quests. No longer the uncertain boy guided by fairy companions and driven by circumstances beyond his control, the mature hero of time would have approached threats with the accumulated wisdom of multiple adventures. His fighting style would have evolved beyond the fundamental techniques learned in his youth, incorporating lessons from his battles against Ganondorf, his encounters with the various incarnations of evil in Termina, and years of continued practice and refinement. The development of the hidden skills that the hero's shade would later teach his descendant likely occurred during this period. These techniques, the ending blow's decisive finishing strike, the shield attacks aggressive defensive tactics, the back slices flanking maneuvers, the helm splitter's aerial mastery, the mortal draw's lightning-quick responses, the jump strike's momentum-driven assault, and the great spin's devastating area control represent the culmination of a lifetime spent perfecting the art of combat. Each of these techniques bears the hallmarks of hard-won experience. The ending blow speaks to encounters with resilient enemies who required decisive finishing moves. The shield attack suggests battles where pure defense proved insufficient, demanding a more aggressive approach. The back slice reveals an understanding of positioning and timing that comes only from facing multiple opponents simultaneously. The helm splitter demonstrates mastery of three-dimensional combat, useful against towering enemies or in vertical environments. The mortal draw, perhaps the most sophisticated of these techniques, requires not just speed, but perfect timing and distance judgment. This skill could only have been developed through countless life-or-death encounters, where the difference between drawing first and drawing fast meant survival. The jump strike's use of momentum and gravity suggests battles in varied terrain, while the great spin's wide-area effectiveness points to situations where the hero faced overwhelming numbers. The preservation and refinement of these techniques became an obsession for the aging hero of time. As his body began to show the inevitable effects of years spent in constant conflict, old wounds that ached in winter, reflexes that had slowed imperceptibly, strength that required more effort to maintain, he became increasingly aware of the knowledge that would die with him. These weren't mere fighting moves, but distillations of strategic thinking, applications of physics and timing that had saved his life countless times. The psychological weight of this accumulated knowledge cannot be understated. The hero of time had faced enemies that would have destroyed lesser warriors, had overcome obstacles that should have been impossible, and had learned through trial and error the subtle differences between techniques that worked and those that proved fatal. This wisdom represented not just personal achievement, but a repository of defensive knowledge that could protect future heroes from making the same potentially lethal mistakes. As the years passed and the hero of time transitioned from active adventurer to elder statesman of heroism, he began to understand the true scope of his responsibility. It wasn't enough to have saved Hyrule multiple times. He needed to ensure that the knowledge gained through those salvations could be transmitted to future generations. The kingdom's safety depended not just on the emergence of new heroes, but on their ability to survive long enough to fulfill their destinies. This growing awareness of mortality and legacy would have colored the hero of time's final years. Even as he enjoyed the domestic comforts of family life and the peaceful satisfaction of a kingdom kept safe, the warrior within him remained alert to the incomplete nature of his service. He had preserved artifacts and inspired legends, but the most crucial element, practical fighting wisdom, remained locked within his aging mind and body. The transition from active heroism to contemplative preparation represents perhaps the most human aspect of the hero of time's story. Like any master craftsman, he faced the inevitable moment when his own abilities would fade while the need for his knowledge remained. Unlike other professions, however, the stakes of this knowledge transfer extended far beyond personal legacy to encompass the very survival of the kingdom he had fought so hard to protect. In his final years, as the hero of time felt the approach of natural death, This unfulfilled obligation would have weighed heavily upon his spirit. He had conquered impossible enemies, mastered the flow of time itself, and saved multiple worlds from destruction. Yet the one task that remained, passing on the distilled wisdom of a lifetime spent in service to heroism, seemed destined to remain incomplete. This realization would plant the seeds of the spiritual binding that would prevent his soul from finding peace, setting the stage for his transformation into the eternal guardian known as the hero's shade. The end came quietly for the hero of time, as it does for most mortals, despite the extraordinary nature of his life. After decades of adventure, family, and service to Hyrule, the legendary warrior who had conquered time itself found that he could not conquer the one enemy that claims all living beings eventually. Yet even in death, the hero of time's story would prove far from over. For the very qualities that had made him Hyrule's greatest champion would become the chains that bound his spirit to the mortal realm. In his final days, as age and old wounds took their inevitable toll, the hero of time's thoughts turned increasingly to the knowledge he had accumulated over a lifetime of battles. The hidden techniques he had developed, refined through countless encounters with enemies both mundane and supernatural, represented more than personal achievement. They were keys to survival that could mean the difference between victory and death for future heroes. This awareness weighed upon his spirit like a stone, growing heavier as his physical strength waned. The deathbed of a hero is rarely a peaceful place, even when surrounded by loving family and the comfort of a life well lived. For the hero of time, the approach of mortality brought not the anticipated relief of rest, but a growing anxiety about unfulfilled obligations. He had saved kingdoms, prevented apocalypses, and protected the innocent across multiple worlds. Yet the most fundamental duty of any master, passing knowledge to the next generation, remained incomplete. Historical accounts, though sparse, suggest that the hero of time's final moments were marked by a profound struggle between acceptance and duty. Those present described a warrior who faced death with the same courage he had shown in life, yet whose eyes betrayed a deep concern for battles yet to be fought by others. His final words, preserved in fragmentary family records, spoke not of his own accomplishments, but of techniques unshared and wisdom untransmitted. The transition from life to death for the hero of time proved to be unlike that experienced by ordinary mortals. Where most souls naturally progress to whatever realm awaits beyond the physical world, his spirit found itself anchored to Hyrule by the weight of uncompleted purpose. This binding was not imposed by external forces, but arose from the hero's own unshakable sense of responsibility, a dedication so profound that it transcended the boundary between life and death. The spiritual mechanics of this binding reveal the complex relationship between will, duty, and the nature of existence itself. The hero of time's connection to the Triforce of Courage had always been more than symbolic. It represented a fundamental alignment with the cosmic forces that shaped Hyrule's destiny. This connection, strengthened by years of heroic service and countless acts of selfless courage, created spiritual roots that extended deep into the kingdom's metaphysical foundation. When death claimed his physical form, these spiritual anchors prevented the hero of time's soul from departing. Instead of finding the peace that typically follows a life of service, he discovered himself caught between worlds, no longer truly alive, but unable to embrace the finality of death. This liminal existence would define his new reality, transforming him from retired hero into eternal guardian. The transformation into what would become known as the hero's shade was neither immediate nor painless. The process unfolded over years, as the hero of time's spirit gradually adapted to its new form of existence. His consciousness, freed from the limitations of flesh but bound by purpose, began to manifest in ways that reflected both his heroic nature and his spiritual torment. The golden armor that would become his signature appeared as a crystallization of his noble intentions, while the skeletal form beneath spoke to the death he had experienced yet could not fully embrace. The single red eye that would become the hero's shade's most distinctive feature represents perhaps the most poignant aspect of his transformation. Where once two eyes had looked upon the world with the full spectrum of human emotion, joy, sorrow, love, determination, now a single burning orb remained, focused with supernatural intensity upon the one purpose that had prevented his spirit's rest. This eye would see not the world as it was, but as it needed to be protected, viewing each potential threat through the lens of accumulated tactical knowledge. The spiritual realm, where the hero's shade would manifest his true form, exists in a space between the mortal world and whatever lies beyond. This ethereal training ground, adorned with ghostly echoes of Hyrule's most significant landmarks, serves as both classroom and prison. Here, surrounded by spectral representations of the places where he had fought his greatest battles, the hero's shade would wait through centuries of solitude for the arrival of his destined student. The psychological toll of this existence cannot be understated. Where mortal heroes face the challenges of their adventures, knowing that success brings the reward of peace, the hero's shade found himself trapped in a cycle of preparation without end. Every technique practiced in solitude, every strategy refined through spiritual contemplation, every moment of his eternal existence served the single purpose of preparing for a student whose arrival remained uncertain. The development of his wolf form during this period represents both adaptation and remembrance. Just as the hero of Twilight would later transform through his connection to the Triforce of Courage, the hero's shade's lupine manifestation arose from his spiritual connection to the same divine artifact. Yet where his descendants' transformation would be a response to external magical influence, the hero's shade's wolf form emerged from internal spiritual pressure, a way for his bound soul to interact with the physical world while maintaining the barrier between life and death. The golden coloration of this wolf form carries deep symbolic significance. Gold, the color of divinity and eternal value, reflects the imperishable nature of true heroism. Unlike the silver gray of his descendants' wolf form, shaped by immediate necessity, the hero's shade's golden wolf embodies the accumulated worth of a lifetime spent in service. This manifestation could move through the mortal realm while remaining fundamentally separate from it, a living symbol of heroic dedication visible to those who possessed the spiritual sensitivity to perceive it. The choice of Faron Woods as his primary dwelling place represents a return to origins that speaks to the deepest aspects of his spiritual condition. The forest where his adventures had begun, now transformed by centuries into the domain of the Forest Temple, offered both familiarity and symbolic appropriateness. Here, Among the ancient trees that had witnessed his first tentative steps toward heroism, the hero's shade would maintain his vigil. The forest temple itself, built within or around the remains of what may once have been the great Deku tree, provided the perfect sanctuary for a spirit caught between worlds. Sacred trees have always served as bridges between the mortal and divine realms in Hyrule's spiritual geography, making this location ideal for a being who existed in the liminal space between life and death. The temple's blend of natural growth and constructed elements mirrors the hero's shade's own nature, part memory of what was, part preparation for what must come. The gravestone found in Hyrule Castle's hidden cemetery, bearing the inscription about a cursed swordsman who sleeps before the sacred tree, suggests that the hero of Time's posthumous binding was recognized by those who honored his memory. The use of the word cursed indicates an understanding that his spiritual condition was not a blessing, but a burden, a price paid for incomplete duty that even death could not release him from fulfilling. This recognition by the royal family and other keepers of Hyrule's history adds another layer of tragedy to the hero's shade's existence. Those who carved that gravestone understood that their greatest champion had found no peace in death, yet they possessed no means to grant him the release he sought. Only the arrival of another hero, one capable of receiving and preserving the accumulated wisdom of the hero of Time's experiences, could break the spiritual chains that bound him to eternal service. The centuries that followed his transformation into the hero's shade represent perhaps the loneliest vigil in recorded history. Alone with his thoughts, his memories, and his unwavering sense of duty, he waited through the rise and fall of generations, watching as Hyrule evolved and changed while he remained constant. The kingdom he had died protecting grew and flourished, yet he could take no satisfaction in its prosperity, while his mission remained unfulfilled. As twilight began to gather over the kingdom once more, as new shadows threatened the peace he had died protecting, the hero's shade finally sensed the approach of his destined student. The bloodline he had established in life had produced another hero, one who carried within him the same courage, the same dedication, and the same left-handed fighting style that marked him as a true inheritor of the heroic tradition. The wait was nearly over, but the most crucial test still lay ahead, whether this new hero would prove capable of receiving and preserving the knowledge that had kept his predecessor's spirit bound to the world for so long. The twilight that descended upon Hyrule in the final years of Princess Zelda's reign brought with it a darkness unlike any the kingdom had known since the hero of Time's era. This was not the natural progression of day into night, but something far more sinister, a supernatural shadow that transformed the very essence of the realm, turning familiar landscapes into alien territories where light itself seemed to struggle for survival. For the hero's shade, who had maintained his solitary vigil for centuries, this encroaching darkness signaled the approach of the moment he had waited for through endless years of spiritual exile. The twilight carried with it more than mere visual transformation. It brought a fundamental alteration to the nature of reality within the affected regions, stripping away the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds that had kept the hero's shade confined to his ethereal existence. As the shadows spread across the land like a living thing, consuming forests, villages, and sacred places with equal hunger, The ancient spirit felt something he had not experienced since his transformation, a stirring of hope mixed with urgent purpose. Deep within the Faron woods, where the hero's shade had kept his watch for so many years, the approaching twilight created disturbances that resonated through both the mortal realm and the spiritual plane where he dwelled. The golden wolf that served as his physical manifestation became more restless, pacing through the undergrowth with an urgency that spoke to supernatural awareness. Something was coming, not just the twilight itself, but a presence within it that carried the unmistakable signature of heroic destiny. When the hero's shade first sensed the approach of his descendant, the recognition came not through sight or sound, but through a resonance that transcended ordinary perception. The spiritual connection that bound all incarnations of the hero created a harmonic frequency that only those touched by the same divine purpose could detect. This was more than mere bloodline kinship. It was the recognition of one destined soul by another, a calling that had waited centuries to be answered. The young man who entered the twilight-touched forests bore the unmistakable marks of heroic heritage. His left-handed stance, his instinctive courage in the face of supernatural threat, his possession of the Triforce of courage, all these elements confirmed what the hero's shade had hoped for through his long vigil. Yet what moved the ancient spirit most profoundly was something less tangible. The quality of determination that marked this youth as a true inheritor of the heroic tradition. The recognition was mutual, though initially expressed through confusion and wariness. When the golden wolf first appeared to the hero of twilight, stalking him through the forest with predatory intent, the young hero's response revealed both his courage and his ignorance. He faced the supernatural creature without fear, yet lacked the knowledge to understand its true nature or purpose. This combination of bravery and inexperience would define their early interactions, creating a dynamic that the hero's shade would need to navigate with careful patience. The decision to reveal himself came after careful observation and testing. The hero's shade watched his descendants progress through the early challenges of his quest, noting not just his combat abilities, but his moral choices, his treatment of others, and his willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for the greater good. These qualities, more than any inherited fighting skill, confirmed that this young man possessed the character necessary to receive the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The spiritual realm where their training would take place manifested as a response to the twilight's influence, creating a bridge between worlds that allowed direct interaction between the living and the dead. This ethereal training ground, adorned with ghostly echoes of Hyrule's most significant landmarks, served as both sanctuary and classroom. Here, surrounded by spectral representations of Death Mountain, the Arbiter's grounds, and Hyrule Castle itself, the hero's shade could finally begin fulfilling the purpose that had bound his spirit to the mortal realm. The ancient armor that adorned the hero's shade in this spiritual manifestation told the story of his long exile through its worn and tarnished appearance. Once gleaming gold, the metal had taken on the patina of ages, each scratch and dent a testament to battles fought in life and spiritual struggles endured in death. The helmet, crafted in an archaic style that predated any armor worn by contemporary knights, bore designs that spoke to the timeless nature of heroic service. The single red eye that burned within the depths of that ancient helm represented perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the hero's shade's appearance. Where his descendants' eyes held the full spectrum of youthful emotion, this singular orb blazed with the concentrated intensity of a spirit that had known no rest for centuries. It was the eye of a being who had seen too much, endured too long, and focused too completely upon a single purpose to retain the full humanity he had once possessed. The skeletal features visible beneath the armor created an inevitable reminder of mortality that the hero's shade carried as both warning and wisdom. Death, the final enemy that even heroes must face, had not claimed him in the traditional sense, but had transformed him into something between the living and the dead. His appearance served as a visual representation of the price that could be paid for incomplete duty, a fate worse than death for those whose sense of responsibility transcended their own mortal existence. When the hero's shade first spoke to his descendant, his words carried the weight of centuries spent in contemplation of heroic duty and the cost of wielding power in service of others. His voice, though emanating from a skeletal frame, retained the authority and compassion that had defined the hero of time in life. Yet there was also a hollowness to it, an echo that spoke to the spiritual emptiness of a soul that had known no peace since leaving the mortal realm. The opening lesson that the hero's shade delivered, that a sword wields no strength unless the hand that holds it has courage, encapsulated not just fighting philosophy, but the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent understanding the true nature of heroism. This was not merely about physical technique, but about the spiritual foundation that made all heroic action possible. Courage, he understood from hard experience, was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act righteously despite that fear. The criticism embedded within this first teaching, that the hero of Twilight's current power would disgrace the proud green of the hero's tunic, might have seemed harsh to casual observers, yet it carried the loving concern of a mentor who understood the stakes involved. The hero's shade had witnessed firsthand the consequences of inadequate preparation, had seen how unready heroes could fall before completing their destined tasks. His harsh words came not from cruelty, but from desperate desire to ensure his descendants' survival. The establishment of their teacher-student relationship marked a fundamental shift in the hero's shade's existence. For the first time since his transformation, he had purpose beyond mere waiting. Each lesson planned, each technique demonstrated, each moment of connection with his descendant brought him closer to the release he had sought through centuries of spiritual exile. Yet even as hope stirred within his bound soul, the weight of accumulated knowledge pressed upon him with renewed urgency. The recognition that this young hero possessed not just courage, but the capacity for growth filled the hero's shade with something approaching joy, an emotion he had thought lost to him forever. Here, finally, was a student worthy of the knowledge he carried, an inheritor capable of preserving and building upon the techniques that had taken a lifetime to develop. The bloodline had proven true, producing not just another bearer of heroic destiny, but one with the wisdom to learn and the strength to endure. As their first encounter drew to its close, the hero's shade felt the familiar pull of his spiritual binding, drawing him back to his eternal vigil. Yet for the first time in centuries, this return to solitude carried with it not despair, but anticipation. The work had begun, the knowledge would be transmitted, and perhaps, if fate proved kind, his long exile might finally find its end in the successful completion of his descendants' training. The first hidden skill that the hero's shade chose to impart represented not just a combat technique, but a fundamental philosophy of heroic warfare. The ending blow, with its decisive downward strike delivered to fallen enemies, embodied the harsh reality that mercy toward evil often resulted in tragedy for the innocent. This technique had been born from the hero of Time's early encounters with enemies who feigned defeat only to strike when his guard was lowered, teaching him through painful experience that true compassion sometimes required absolute finality. The spiritual weight of this lesson extended far beyond its practical application. When the hero's shade demonstrated the ending blow in the ethereal training ground, his movements carried the accumulated sorrow of every moment when hesitation had cost lives, every instance where incomplete victory had allowed darkness to return stronger than before. The technique required not just physical precision, but moral certainty. The ability to recognize when an enemy's defeat served the greater good, and the courage to act upon that recognition without doubt or delay. The development of this skill had come through bitter necessity during the hero of Time's forgotten adventures. Early in his career, his natural compassion had led him to spare enemies who appeared helpless, only to discover that creatures aligned with darkness possessed no honor and would exploit any perceived weakness. The ending blow represented the crystallization of hard-earned wisdom that evil, once defeated, must be prevented from rising again through decisive action rather than naive hope for redemption. As the hero of Twilight mastered this first technique, the hero's shade observed with satisfaction the young hero's understanding of its deeper implications. This was not about cruelty or revenge, but about accepting the heavy responsibility that came with wielding power in defense of others. The ability to end threats permanently, when circumstances demanded it, marked the transition from amateur warrior to true guardian of the innocent. The shield attack emerged from the hero of Time's recognition that passive defense often proved insufficient against aggressive enemies. Traditional shield work focused on blocking and deflection, creating space for counterattacks through patient timing and positioning. Yet certain foes, particularly those driven by supernatural rage or magical enhancement, could overwhelm even the most skilled defensive fighters through sheer relentless pressure. The shield attack transformed the shield from mere protective tool into offensive weapon, allowing defenders to seize initiative even while maintaining protective stance. The technique's development reflected the hero of Time's encounters with enemies who expected traditional fighting patterns. By weaponizing the shield itself, he had created opportunities where none existed before, stunning opponents who anticipated only defensive reactions from a raised shield. The sharp edge of a reinforced shield, driven with proper technique and timing, could stagger even heavily armored foes, creating openings for devastating follow-up strikes. Teaching this skill required particular attention to timing and distance judgment. The hero's shade emphasized that the shield attack worked not through brute force, but through precise application of leverage and momentum. The technique demanded understanding of enemy psychology as much as physical mechanics, recognizing the moment when an opponent committed fully to an attack, leaving themselves vulnerable to unexpected shield-based counteraction. The back slice represented perhaps the most tactically sophisticated of the hidden skills requiring spatial awareness and positioning that could only be developed through extensive combat experience. This technique allowed a warrior to maneuver behind enemies who had committed to forward attacks, delivering strikes to vulnerable rear positions where armor was typically lighter and vital organs more accessible. The skill demanded not just agility, but strategic thinking, the ability to predict enemy movement patterns and position oneself advantageously during the chaos of combat. The hero of time had perfected this technique during encounters with heavily armored opponents whose front-facing defenses proved nearly impenetrable. By studying enemy movement patterns and timing his repositioning with their attack commitments, he had learned to exploit the fundamental limitation of heavy armor, its restriction of peripheral vision and rapid turning ability. The back slice transformed this limitation into tactical opportunity, allowing smaller, more agile fighters to defeat opponents who might otherwise prove overwhelming. The psychological aspect of this technique proved as important as its physical execution. Enemies who found themselves repeatedly struck from unexpected angles experienced mounting frustration and panic, leading to increasingly desperate and predictable attack patterns. The back slice thus served dual purposes, delivering effective strikes while undermining enemy morale and tactical coherence. The helm splitter emerged from the hero of time's necessity to engage flying enemies and opponents who utilized elevated positions for tactical advantage. Traditional ground-based sword work proved inadequate against aerial threats or enemies positioned on higher terrain, requiring development of techniques that incorporated vertical movement and aerial timing. This skill combined acrobatic ability with precise strike timing, allowing warriors to deliver devastating downward blows to enemy heads and shoulders. The technique's origins lay in the hero of time's encounters with creatures like Stalfos knights, whose height advantage and overhead striking ability created significant tactical challenges. By learning to vault over such enemies using his own momentum and environmental features, he had developed methods for turning their size advantage into vulnerability. The helm splitter required perfect timing, launching the leap at precisely the right moment to avoid enemy strikes while positioning for maximum impact upon landing. The aerial nature of this technique demanded complete spatial awareness and confidence in one's athletic abilities. The hero's shade emphasized that failure in execution often resulted in landing within easy reach of enemy weapons, making precision and commitment absolutely essential. The technique worked best against tall, relatively slow-moving opponents, whose size made them confident in their ability to deal with ground-based threats. The mortal draw stood apart from other hidden skills in its revelation of the hero's shade's most closely guarded secret. When demonstrating this lightning-fast quick-draw technique, the ancient spirit's worn scabbard became visible, the unmistakable sheath of the master sword, aged and weathered by centuries, but still recognizable to those familiar with sacred artifacts. This moment provided definitive proof of the hero's shade's identity, while revealing the depth of his connection to Hyrule's most legendary weapon. The technique itself represented the pinnacle of sword-drawing speed and precision, allowing a warrior to unsheath, strike, and resheath a blade in one fluid motion faster than most enemies could react. The mortal draw had been developed for situations where traditional combat proved impossible. Ambush scenarios, diplomatic meetings that turned violent, or encounters where drawing a weapon openly would escalate dangerous situations unnecessarily. The Master Sword's scabbard served as both symbol and practical tool in teaching this technique. Its construction, designed specifically to house the sacred blade, incorporated features that facilitated the smooth, silent drawing motion essential to the mortal draw's effectiveness. The hero's shade's possession of this artifact raised profound questions about his post-mortem adventures, suggesting that even in death, his connection to Hyrule's sacred weapons remained unbroken. The jump strike built upon principles established in the Helm Splitter, but focused on horizontal rather than vertical enemy positioning. This technique allowed warriors to cover significant distances while delivering powerful strikes, combining momentum from forward movement with the devastating impact of a leaping attack. The skill proved particularly effective against enemies who relied on reach advantage or positioning behind obstacles. The Hero of Time had developed this technique during encounters with enemies who used terrain features for protection, creatures positioned behind barriers, on elevated platforms, or across gaps that normal movement could not easily cross. The jump strike transformed such defensive positions into targets of opportunity, allowing agile warriors to bypass obstacles entirely while delivering crushing attacks to surprised enemies. The technique required careful judgment of distance and timing, as miscalculation could result in falling short of the target or overextending into dangerous positions. The hero's shade emphasized that the jump strike worked best when enemies were focused on other threats or believed themselves safely positioned beyond immediate reach. The psychological impact of seemingly impossible aerial attacks often proved as valuable as their physical effectiveness. The Great Spin, the final and most devastating of the hidden skills, represented the culmination of a lifetime spent mastering circular sword movement and area control. This technique allowed a warrior to strike multiple enemies simultaneously through a spinning attack that created a protective sphere of steel around the fighter's position. The Great Spin demanded perfect balance, extraordinary physical conditioning, and absolute spatial awareness of all surrounding threats. The development of this ultimate technique had emerged from the Hero of Time's encounters with overwhelming numbers of enemies, situations where traditional fighting methods proved inadequate against coordinated group attacks. By learning to use his entire body as a weapon delivery system, spinning with controlled precision while maintaining balance and striking power, he had created a technique capable of clearing entire groups of enemies in seconds. The hero's shade's demonstration of the Great Spin carried particular emotional weight, as this technique represented the absolute pinnacle of his accumulated fighting wisdom. The fluid, devastating motion that swept through multiple imaginary opponents revealed the true extent of his mastery, while highlighting the tragic irony of his situation, possessing ultimate combat knowledge, yet being unable to use it for active, heroic service. Each hidden skill carried within it not just technical instruction, but fragments of the Hero of Time's accumulated experience, wisdom gained through encounters that had tested every aspect of his abilities. The patient transmission of this knowledge represented more than education. It was the gradual transfer of a heroic legacy that had been preserved through centuries of spiritual exile, finally finding its proper inheritor in the bloodline that had waited generations to produce another worthy student. The revelation of familial connection between the hero's shade and the hero of twilight stands as one of the most profound aspects of their supernatural relationship, transforming what might have been merely a mentorship into something far more intimate and meaningful. When the ancient spirit first addressed his descendant as "my child," the words carried weight that transcended casual endearment, establishing a bloodline connection that had persevered through centuries of separation and the ultimate barrier of death itself. This ancestral bond explains numerous mysteries that had surrounded the hero of Twilight's unique circumstances from the beginning of his adventure. Unlike previous incarnations of the hero, who had needed to prove themselves worthy of divine artifacts through trials and tribulation, the hero of Twilight possessed the Triforce of courage from birth, as if it were an inherited birthright rather than an earned blessing. This natural possession of one of the three sacred triangles speaks to a bloodline so deeply connected to heroic destiny that divine power flowed through it like a hereditary trait. The genetic inheritance extended beyond mystical artifacts to encompass physical and behavioral characteristics that marked the hero of Twilight as unmistakably descended from his legendary ancestor. The left-handed sword work that both heroes employed was not merely a coincidence of training, but an inherited trait that had been passed down through generations of the bloodline. This particular fighting stance, relatively uncommon among warriors who typically favored right-handed techniques, served as a biological signature connecting ancestor and descendant across the vast expanse of time. More remarkable still was the shared ability to assume lupine form, a transformation that spoke to spiritual inheritance as much as physical genetics. The hero of Twilight's wolf transformation, triggered by exposure to the Twilight realm's supernatural influence, revealed capabilities that lay dormant within his bloodline until circumstances activated them. This metamorphosis was not a curse imposed from without, but a manifestation of inherited spiritual flexibility that allowed him to adapt to supernatural threats in ways that ordinary mortals could not. The hero's shade recognized this lupine connection immediately, understanding that his descendant's ability to take wolf form represented the same divine beast nature that allowed his own spectral manifestation as the golden wolf. This shared characteristic created a bridge between their forms of existence, allowing the ancient spirit to interact with his descendant in ways that would have been impossible with an unrelated hero. The significance of this bloodline connection extends far beyond mere family sentiment to encompass the very mechanics of heroic destiny within Hyrule's spiritual framework. The kingdom's protection had always depended upon the periodic emergence of heroes capable of wielding divine power in defense of the innocent. Yet the appearance of such champions had never been guaranteed. The establishment of a heroic bloodline provided a degree of continuity that ensured appropriate champions would emerge when needed. This hereditary aspect of heroism raised profound questions about the nature of divine selection and personal choice. Was the hero of Twilight heroic because he chose to act courageously, or did his bloodline predispose him toward heroic behavior? The hero's shade's teachings suggested a complex interaction between inherited potential and conscious decision-making, where genetic heritage provided capability, but personal choice determined its application. The secret knowledge that the hero's shade chose to share exclusively with his bloodline descendant represented more than mere fighting techniques. It constituted a family legacy of accumulated wisdom that had been preserved through death itself. When he spoke of forgotten ways that do not leave our bloodline, he referred to combat knowledge that had been developed through generations of heroic service, refined through countless battles, and deemed too dangerous or powerful for general dissemination. These inherited techniques carried with them not just mechanical instruction, but spiritual understanding that could only be fully appreciated by those who shared the bloodline's connection to heroic destiny. The hidden skills were not merely sword movements, but expressions of a fundamental approach to combat that had been shaped by divine purpose and tested through supernatural conflicts. Only a true descendant could understand the spiritual components that made these techniques effective beyond their physical execution. The light spirit. Farron's recognition of ancient power sleeping within the hero of Twilight provided external confirmation of the bloodline's significance. When the spirit granted the hero his ancestors' green tunic, the act represented more than ceremonial investiture. It was acknowledgement that the genetic heritage carried within it the dormant potential for heroic greatness. The tunic itself served as both symbol and catalyst, awakening capabilities that had been present but inactive within the bloodline. This awakening process revealed the sophisticated nature of heroic inheritance within the bloodline. Rather than automatically conferring ability, the genetic heritage created potential that required proper circumstances and conscious choice to manifest fully. The hero of Twilight's courage was his own, but his capacity for courage had been enhanced by generations of heroic ancestry that had expanded the bloodline's spiritual resilience and connection to divine power. The unique position of the hero of Twilight as the only link canonically descended from another creates fascinating implications for understanding the cyclical nature of heroic reincarnation. Where other incarnations of the hero represented entirely new souls chosen by divine forces, the hero of Twilight embodied both continuation and renewal, carrying forward his ancestors' legacy while establishing his own heroic identity. This dual nature explained the unusual intensity of the hero's shade's investment in his descendants' success. For the ancient spirit, the hero of Twilight represented not just another hero requiring training, but the continuation of his own bloodline and the validation of his life's work. The successful completion of his descendants' quest would prove that the sacrifices made in establishing the heroic bloodline had served their intended purpose. The emotional complexity of their relationship stemmed from this mixture of familial affection and professional necessity. The hero's shade's protective instincts toward his descendant went beyond normal mentorship to encompass paternal concern for family legacy and genetic continuation. Yet this personal investment had to be balanced against the harsh realities of heroic training, where emotional attachment could interfere with the objective instruction necessary for survival. The bloodline's spiritual properties also explained the natural resonance between ancestor and descendant that allowed their supernatural communication. Where other spirits might struggle to interact with living mortals, across the barrier between life and death, the shared genetic heritage created a spiritual frequency that transcended normal limitations. This connection allowed the hero's shade to manifest more fully in his descendants' presence and communicate with clarity impossible with unrelated individuals. The inheritance of Triforce connection through bloodline represented perhaps the most significant aspect of their genetic relationship. The hero's shade's own powerful connection to the Triforce of courage had apparently created permanent changes within his spiritual essence that could be transmitted to his descendants. This explained not only the hero of Twilight's natural possession of the sacred triangle, but also his instinctive understanding of its power and proper application. The establishment of this heroic bloodline represented the hero of Time's greatest gift to Hyrule's future, a legacy that extended far beyond his own individual accomplishments to ensure that appropriate champions would emerge when darkness threatened the kingdom again. Through his descendants, his heroic spirit would continue to serve Hyrule long after his own death, creating a form of immortality that transcended any single lifetime or adventure. As the hero's shade completed his descendants' training, the fulfillment of this bloodline destiny became apparent. The knowledge that had been preserved through death itself had finally found its proper inheritor, ensuring that the accumulated wisdom of heroic generations would continue forward into an uncertain future. The bloodline had proven its worth, producing not just another hero, but one capable of surpassing even his legendary ancestors' achievements. The Howling Stones, scattered across Hyrule, stand as monuments to memory, each weathered pillar containing within its ancient structure the power to bridge the gap between past and present through the universal language of music. These mystical artifacts, carved from stone that predates recorded history, serve as more than mere summoning devices for the hero's shade. They represent repositories of emotional memory, each melody locked within their crystalline hearts, carrying the weight of experiences that shaped the hero of Time's legendary journey. When the hero of Twilight first discovered these stones during his travels, their purpose remained mysterious. Their wolf-shaped carvings suggesting a connection to his own lupine transformation without revealing the deeper significance of their musical nature. Only through the instinctive howling that his wolf form produced in their presence did the true function of these monuments become apparent, as each stone responded to his call by releasing melodies that had been waiting centuries to be heard again. Zelda's Lullaby, the first and perhaps most significant of these preserved songs, carries within its gentle notes the entire foundation of the hero of Time's relationship with the royal family and his understanding of divine duty. This melody, taught to him by Princess Zelda, herself in the courtyard of Hyrule Castle, had served as both key and credential. Throughout his adventures, opening doors both literal and metaphorical, while establishing his legitimacy as the chosen champion of the crown. The emotional resonance of this particular song for the hero's shade cannot be overstated. Every note carried memories of that first meeting with Princess Zelda, when a forest boy's destiny had been forever altered by royal recognition and sacred trust. The melody had accompanied him through the most crucial moments of his journey, opening the path to Death Mountain, revealing hidden passages in sacred temples, and serving as proof of his divine mandate when doubt arose about his authority to act as Hyrule's defender. When the hero's shade howled this lullaby in the spiritual realm where he trained his descendant, the notes carried not just musical information, but the weight of responsibility that came with royal trust. Each phrase of the melody represented a lesson in the delicate balance between personal desire and public duty that every true hero must learn to navigate. The lullaby had been Princess Zelda's gift to him, but it had become his burden as well, a constant reminder of the expectations and obligations that accompanied heroic status. Epona's song emerged from the howling stones, with all the freedom and joy that had defined the hero of Time's relationship with his beloved horse. This melody, learned from Malone in the peaceful surroundings of Lon Ranch, represented one of the few purely positive memories from his childhood, a time when music created bonds of friendship rather than unlocking doors to greater responsibility. The song had called Epona to his side across the vast fields of Hyrule, establishing a partnership that transcended the typical relationship between rider and mount. The preservation of this particular melody within the Howling Stones speaks to the central role that Epona had played, not just in the hero of Time's adventures, but in his emotional well-being. In a life defined by solitary quests and supernatural burdens, the faithful horse had provided companionship that asked for nothing more than care and trust in return. Epona's song represented the possibility of uncomplicated love and loyalty in a world where every other relationship carried the weight of cosmic significance. For the hero's shade, howling this melody brought memories of dawn rides across Hyrule Field, of the wind rushing past as Epona's hooves thundered across the grasslands, of moments when the burden of heroic destiny could be temporarily forgotten in the simple joy of movement and partnership. The song carried within it the essence of freedom that every hero craved but rarely achieved, the ability to move through the world without constantly bearing the weight of others' expectations and needs. The prelude of light, with its sacred cadences and divine resonance, preserved within the Howling Stones the hero of Time's profound connection to the Temple of Time and the mystical forces that governed Hyrule's destiny. This melody had served as his primary link to the sacred realm where the Master Sword waited, allowing him to traverse instantly between the mundane world and the spiritual center of the kingdom's power. Each note carried the weight of temporal manipulation and divine intervention that had defined his most crucial adventures. The emotional significance of this prelude extended beyond its practical applications to encompass the hero of Time's complex relationship with time itself. The melody had been his key to the adult timeline where his greatest victories had been won, yet it also represented the barrier between his childhood and the accelerated maturity that heroic responsibility had forced upon him. Every time he had played this song, he had crossed not just physical space, but temporal boundaries that separated innocence from experience. When the hero's shade howled the prelude of light centuries later, the melody carried all the weight of temporal paradox that had defined his existence. He had used this song to travel to a future that no longer existed, to fight battles that had been erased from history, to save a world that had been restored to a state where his salvation was no longer needed. The prelude represented both his greatest triumph and his deepest tragedy, the power to transcend time itself, used in service of a victory that only he would remember. The requiem of spirit, preserved in the Howling Stones with all its haunting complexity, carried memories of the hero of Time's journey into the vast desert wasteland where the spirit temple stood as a monument to both wisdom and desolation. This melody had been his key to one of the most challenging and emotionally complex of his temple trials, where past and future had intersected in ways that challenged his understanding of identity and purpose. The desert temple had forced the hero of time to confront fundamental questions about the nature of self and time, requiring him to work with both his child and adult incarnations to overcome obstacles that neither could surmount alone. The Requiem of Spirit had facilitated this temporal collaboration while serving as a constant reminder of the fragmented nature of his existence across multiple timelines and ages. For the hero's shade, this melody carried particular poignancy because it represented his most profound encounter with the malleable nature of existence itself. The spirit temple had shown him that identity was not fixed, that the boundaries between past and future were more permeable than most beings understood, and that wisdom often required embracing paradox rather than resolving it. These lessons had prepared him, perhaps unknowingly, for his eventual existence as a being caught between life and death. The Song of Healing stands apart from the other preserved melodies, not just in its origins, learned in the parallel world of Termina rather than Hyrule proper, but in its deeply personal significance to the hero. Of time's psychological and spiritual development, this melody, taught to him by the enigmatic Happy Mask Salesman, possessed the power to heal troubled spirits and transform cursed beings back to their natural states, making it perhaps the most intimate and personally meaningful of all the songs he had learned. The acquisition of the Song of Healing had marked a crucial evolution in the hero of time's understanding of his role as a champion of justice. Where his previous adventures had focused primarily on defeating evil through combat and puzzle solving, the events in Termina had required him to develop skills of empathy, psychological healing, and spiritual restoration. The Song of Healing represented the culmination of these gentler, heroic arts, embodying his growth from a warrior who defeated enemies to a healer who restored wholeness to broken souls. The preservation of this particular melody within the Howling Stones suggests that the hero's shade recognized its relevance to his own spiritual condition. As a being trapped between life and death by unfulfilled purpose, he embodied precisely the kind of troubled spirit that the Song of Healing was designed to aid. The tragic irony was that while he possessed the knowledge to heal others, he could not apply this wisdom to his own situation. His spiritual wounds were too deeply tied to his sense of duty to be healed until that duty was fulfilled. When the hero's shade howled the Song of Healing in the presence of his descendant, the melody served multiple purposes beyond mere instruction. It provided a form of spiritual therapy for his own troubled state, offering temporary relief from the centuries of accumulated regret and isolation that had defined his existence. More importantly, it prepared his descendant for the psychological challenges that heroic service would inevitably bring, teaching him that true heroism sometimes required healing rather than fighting. The act of howling these preserved melodies created a unique form of communication between ancestor and descendant that transcended ordinary instruction. Through music, the hero's shade could transmit not just technical knowledge, but emotional understanding, sharing the full spectrum of experiences that had shaped his legendary career. Each note carried memories, lessons, and warnings that no amount of verbal instruction could adequately convey. The Howling Stones themselves served as more than mere storage devices for these musical memories. They represented the hero of time's unconscious attempt to preserve aspects of his identity that went beyond combat skills and tactical knowledge. Music had been one of the few constants in his chaotic life, providing both practical utility and emotional expression in ways that weapons and tools could not. By ensuring these melodies survived his physical death, he had preserved the most human aspects of his heroic journey. The psychological impact of hearing these ancient songs on the hero of Twilight cannot be understated. Through the melodies, he gained insight into his ancestors' emotional journey that no amount of combat training could provide. He learned that heroism involved not just courage and skill, but also loss, sacrifice, and the weight of responsibilities that could never be fully shared with others. The songs prepared him for the psychological challenges of his own quest, while honoring the memory of those who had walked the heroic path before him. The final significance of the Howling Stones and their preserved melodies lies in their role as bridges between the living and the dead, allowing the hero's shade to share not just his knowledge, but his humanity with his descendant. Through these musical memories, the ancient spirit proved that even death could not completely sever the bonds between those who shared the burden of heroic destiny. The culmination of the hero's shade's centuries-long vigil arrived not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the quiet satisfaction of a duty finally fulfilled. When the hero of Twilight had mastered the seventh and final hidden skill, the Great Spin, something fundamental shifted in the spiritual atmosphere of their ethereal training ground. The ancient techniques that had been preserved through death itself had found their proper inheritor, and the knowledge that had bound the hero's shade to the mortal realm for so long had finally been transmitted in its entirety. The moment of completion carried with it a profound sense of release that the hero's shade had not experienced since his mortal death. For centuries, the weight of untransmitted knowledge had pressed upon his spirit like a physical burden, growing heavier with each passing year as the techniques he had developed through a lifetime of heroic service remained locked within his consciousness. Now, as he watched his descendant execute the final spinning technique with growing mastery, that burden began to lift for the first time in his undead existence. The hero's shade's satisfaction extended beyond mere pedagogical success to encompass validation of his entire posthumous existence. Every year spent in spiritual exile, every decade of solitary waiting, every century of patient guardianship had been justified by this moment when his accumulated wisdom found its proper recipient. The sacrifices that had seemed endless and purposeless during the darkest periods of his vigil now revealed themselves as necessary preparation for this crucial transfer of knowledge. Yet even as relief flooded through his ancient spirit, the hero's shade recognized that his role as mentor had evolved beyond simple instruction. The 7 hidden skills represented only the technical foundation of heroic combat. The true education lay in the wisdom that came from understanding when and how to apply such techniques in service of justice. This deeper knowledge required not just demonstration, but careful explanation of the moral framework that governed heroic action. The revelation of his true motivation came naturally as the training reached its conclusion, emerging from the hero's shade's need to ensure his descendant understood the full scope of heroic responsibility. When he spoke of accepting life as the hero, but being unable to convey the lessons of that life to those who came after, he revealed the fundamental truth that had driven his spiritual binding. This was not about personal glory or recognition, but about the preservation of knowledge essential for protecting the innocent. The distinction between his actual motivation and the explanation later provided in official histories represents one of the most fascinating aspects of the hero's Shade's character. While some accounts suggested he had remained bound by regret over lack of recognition, his own words revealed a far nobler purpose. The inability to pass on crucial knowledge had been the true source of his spiritual unrest, demonstrating that even in death, his primary concern remained the welfare of others rather than his own legacy. This clarification of motivation cast new light on the hero of Time's entire posthumous existence. Rather than being driven by wounded pride or desire for remembrance, he had been motivated by the teacher's fundamental obligation to ensure important knowledge survived beyond his own lifetime. His centuries of spiritual exile represented perhaps the ultimate act of pedagogical dedication, remaining available as an instructor until the proper student appeared, regardless of the personal cost involved. The emotional weight of finally fulfilling this obligation manifested in the hero's Shade's growing sense of peace as the training sessions progressed. Where his earlier appearances had been marked by urgency and barely contained desperation, his final interactions with his descendant displayed a calm satisfaction that spoke to approaching resolution. The knowledge had been transmitted, the student had proven worthy, and the long vigil was nearing its end. The hero's Shade's final words to his descendant carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of accumulated wisdom, distilled into essential truths. Beyond the technical instruction of combat skills lay deeper lessons about the nature of heroism itself, the understanding that true strength came not from physical prowess, but from moral courage, that victory meant protecting others rather than defeating enemies, and that the greatest heroes were often those whose sacrifices remained unrecognized by history. These philosophical teachings represented perhaps the most valuable aspect of the hero's Shade's instruction, providing his descendant with the ethical framework necessary to navigate the moral complexities that accompanied heroic responsibility. Technical skill alone could create effective warriors, but wisdom was required to create true heroes who would use their abilities in service of justice rather than personal advancement. The gradual fading of the hero's Shade's presence as the training concluded reflected the loosening of the spiritual bonds that had held him to the mortal realm. Each transmitted technique, each shared insight, each moment of connection with his descendant had worked to unravel the obligations that had prevented his soul from finding peace. The completion of his pedagogical mission represented not just professional fulfillment, but spiritual liberation from the duty that had defined his existence for centuries. The transformation in the hero's Shade's demeanor during these final encounters was particularly striking to those sensitive enough to perceive it. Where his earlier manifestations had been marked by the desperate intensity of unfulfilled purpose, his final appearances displayed the serene acceptance of a soul preparing for its rightful rest. The knowledge had been preserved, the bloodline had proven worthy, and the future of heroic tradition in Hyrule had been secured. The legacy secured through this transmission of knowledge extended far beyond the immediate benefit to the hero of Twilight. By ensuring these techniques survived, The hero's shade had created a repository of tactical wisdom that could benefit future generations of heroes and warriors. The hidden skills would continue to evolve and adapt as they were passed down, but their fundamental principles would remain as enduring contributions to the defense of the innocent. The hero's shade's recognition that his descendant had surpassed even his own capabilities brought a unique form of paternal pride that transcended normal family relationships. This was not just an ancestor taking satisfaction in genetic legacy, but a master acknowledging that his student had grown beyond the need for further instruction. The hero of Twilight had absorbed the transmitted knowledge and made it his own, adding personal innovations that enhanced the effectiveness of the ancient techniques. The approaching resolution of the hero's shade's spiritual binding manifested in increasing translucency during his final appearances, as if his connection to the physical realm was gradually weakening as his purpose neared completion. This visual transformation served as both metaphor and reality. The ancient spirit was literally becoming lighter as the burdens that had anchored him to mortality were lifted through successful knowledge transmission. The final lesson that the hero's shade imparted went beyond combat techniques to encompass the fundamental truth about heroic service. That true heroes often worked in obscurity, their greatest victories unknown to those they protected, their sacrifices unrecognized by the history that would judge their lives. This understanding prepared his descendant for the psychological challenges of heroic duty while honoring the countless unnamed champions who had served justice throughout the ages. As the last echoes of instruction faded in the ethereal training ground, the hero's shade felt the approach of the peace that had been denied to him for so long. The knowledge that had kept his spirit bound to the world of the living had found its proper home in his descendants' capable hands. The vigilant guardian could finally rest, secure in the knowledge that Hyrule's heroic tradition would continue into an uncertain future, strengthened by the wisdom of the past and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The fulfillment of his teaching mission represented more than personal resolution for the hero's shade. It marked the completion of a cycle of heroic succession that had been generations in the making. Through his patient instruction and careful preservation of combat wisdom, he had ensured that the sacrifices of his mortal life would continue to serve the cause of justice long after his spirit had found its final rest. The journey that had begun with a forest boy's awakening to destiny reached its final destination, not in the grand halls of Hyrule Castle or upon some legendary battlefield, but in the quiet depths of Faron Woods, where ancient trees stood as silent witnesses to the conclusion of an epic that had spanned multiple lifetimes. The hero's shade's long exile from peaceful rest was drawing to its close, and with it came the profound satisfaction of a soul that had finally discharged every obligation that had bound it to the mortal realm. The transformation from legendary hero to restless spirit to eternal guardian represented perhaps the most complete character arc in all of Hyrule's recorded history. The boy who had once awakened in Kokiri Forest with nothing but courage and curiosity had evolved through triumph and tragedy into something beyond mortal comprehension. A being whose dedication to heroic duty had transcended the ultimate boundary of death itself. His journey encompassed not just the salvation of kingdoms, but the preservation of knowledge essential for future generations of champions. The tragic nobility of the hero's shade's existence lay in its demonstration that true heroism often demanded sacrifices that extended far beyond what most beings could comprehend. Where ordinary heroes faced the prospect of dying for their cause, the hero of time had endured something far more challenging, living beyond death in service to that same cause, maintaining his vigil through centuries of solitude and spiritual torment until his duty could be properly fulfilled. This extension of sacrifice beyond the grave spoke to fundamental truths about the nature of heroic character that transcended individual circumstances. The qualities that had made the hero of time capable of saving Hyrule in life, his unwavering sense of duty, his refusal to abandon responsibility, his willingness to endure personal cost for the benefit of others, were the same characteristics that had prevented his spirit from finding peace in death. His greatest strengths had become his spiritual chains, binding him to existence until every obligation had been discharged. The forest temple, standing in the heart of Faron Woods, where the hero's shade had maintained his final vigil, represented more than mere coincidence of location. This sacred tree, hollowed and transformed into a place of spiritual significance, served as the perfect sanctuary for a being caught between the world of the living and whatever realm lay beyond. The temple's nature as both living organism and constructed shrine mirrored the hero's shade's own dual existence, part memory of what had been, part preparation for what must come. The connection to Kokiri Forest, where the hero of time's adventures had first begun, created a poetic symmetry that spoke to the cyclical nature of heroic destiny. The forest that had nurtured his childhood, that had taught him the value of protecting the innocent and the importance of courage in the face of uncertainty, had become the final resting place for his restless spirit. After a lifetime spent traveling across Hyrule and beyond, he had returned to the source of his heroic inspiration. The gravestone inscription referencing a cursed swordsman who sleeps before the sacred tree takes on profound significance when considered in the context of the hero's shade's final rest. The choice of the word cursed reflects an understanding that his spiritual condition was not a blessing, but a burden imposed by incomplete duty. Those who honored his memory recognized that their greatest champion had found no peace in death, yet they lacked the power to grant him the release he sought. The sacred tree mentioned in the inscription, whether referring to the forest temple itself or the greater spiritual significance of the ancient forest, represented the bridge between mortal and divine, realms that made the hero's shade's existence possible. Trees, particularly those of great age and spiritual significance, had always served as conduits between different planes of existence in Hyrule's metaphysical geography, making them ideal anchors for spirits caught between life and death. The hero's shade's return to his forest origins carried emotional weight that extended beyond mere geographical convenience. In choosing this location for his vigil, he had surrounded himself with the memories of his innocent beginnings, when heroism had seemed like adventure rather than burden. The contrast between his current existence and those early days served as both torment and motivation, reminding him of what he had sacrificed while reinforcing the importance of preserving that innocence for future generations. The completion of his pedagogical mission and the subsequent loosening of his spiritual bonds allowed the hero's shade to experience something he had not known for centuries: the prospect of genuine rest. As the final hidden skill was mastered and the last lesson transmitted, the obligations that had anchored his soul to the mortal realm began to dissolve, creating the possibility for the peaceful afterlife that had been denied to him for so long. The process of spiritual release manifested gradually, as if his soul needed time to adjust to the concept of freedom after centuries of self-imposed bondage. The hero's shade's increasing translucency during his final appearances reflected this loosening of worldly ties as his connection to the physical realm weakened in proportion to the completion of his duties. Each transmitted technique, each shared insight, each moment of successful instruction worked to unravel the complex web of obligation that had defined his existence. The impact of the hero's shade's teachings on the salvation of Hyrule extended far beyond the immediate benefit to the hero of Twilight. Without the hidden skills and tactical wisdom transmitted through their supernatural mentorship, the young hero's quest might have ended in failure, leaving the kingdom to fall under the shadow of Xanth's Twilight Realm. The ancient spirit's patient preservation of combat knowledge had quite literally saved the world, proving that his centuries of exile had served an essential purpose. The Master Sword's return to active service through the hero of Twilight represented the culmination of the hero's shade's connection to Hyrule's sacred traditions. The blade that had defined so much of his mortal existence, whose scabbard he had carried through death itself, had found its way into worthy hands once again. This transfer of the legendary weapon from ancestor to descendant symbolized the passing of heroic responsibility from one generation to the next. The spiritual completion achieved through successful knowledge transmission created a form of redemption that transcended traditional religious concepts. The hero's shade had found salvation not through divine intervention or forgiveness of sins, but through the fulfillment of self-imposed obligations that reflected the highest ideals of heroic service. His peace came from the knowledge that his sacrifices had served their intended purpose and that the future was secure. The parallels between his spiritual journey and the natural cycle of forest life provided fitting metaphor for his final transition. Just as ancient trees eventually fall to make room for new growth, while their essence enriches the soil for future generations, the hero's shade's long vigil had nurtured the ground from which future heroes would spring. His accumulated wisdom had become spiritual compost, feeding the roots of heroic tradition that would continue to grow long after his own rest had begun. The death he had conquered through fulfilled purpose represented a victory more complete than any achieved during his mortal adventures. Where his living triumphs had saved kingdoms and prevented catastrophes, his spiritual perseverance had ensured that the knowledge necessary for future salvations would survive beyond any single lifetime. He had achieved a form of immortality that transcended personal glory to encompass eternal service to the ideals he had championed in life. As the final echoes of his presence faded from the forest temple and the golden wolf was seen no more in Faron Woods, the hero's shade finally claimed the rest that had been denied to him for so long. His spirit, freed at last from the burdens of incomplete duty, could embrace the peace that awaited beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. The cursed swordsman slept at last before the sacred tree, his long vigil ended, and his greatest victory finally achieved. The eternal rest that claimed the hero's shade represented not an ending, but a transformation. From active guardian to inspiring memory, from restless spirit to peaceful ancestor, from bound soul to liberated legend, whose story would continue to inspire courage in future generations of heroes who would face their own impossible challenges in defense of the innocent. In the vast tapestry of Hyrule's legendary figures, none embodies the profound cost of heroic duty, quite like the hero's shade, whose story stands as perhaps the most tragic and beautiful testament to the price of eternal service. His journey from celebrated champion to restless spirit to peaceful ancestor represents the ultimate expression of heroic dedication, a commitment so absolute that it transcended the fundamental boundary between life and death itself. The tragedy of the hero's shade lies not in failure or defeat, but in the very success that defined his existence. Where other heroes faced the prospect of glorious death in service to their cause, he endured something far more challenging: continued existence beyond mortality, driven by obligations that his own noble character would not allow him to abandon. His greatest strength became his spiritual prison, demonstrating how the qualities that make heroes exceptional can also become the source of their deepest suffering. Yet within this tragedy lies profound beauty that speaks to the transformative power of selfless service. The hero's shade's centuries of patient waiting, his preservation of essential knowledge through the darkest periods of spiritual isolation, his unwavering commitment to preparing future champions. These actions represent heroism in its purest form, stripped of glory and recognition, yet maintained through sheer moral conviction. His story proves that true heroism often occurs in darkness, witnessed only by the conscience of the hero himself. The poetic justice of his final rest in the heart of Faron Woods, where ancient trees stand guard over the place where his journey began, speaks to the cyclical nature of all heroic destinies. The forest that had nurtured his innocent beginnings became the sanctuary for his spiritual completion, creating a perfect circle that encompassed both the wonder of heroic awakening and the peace of duty fulfilled. In returning to these origins, he demonstrated that every hero's journey ultimately leads home. His teachings live on through his descendant and the continuing cycle of heroism that protects Hyrule, ensuring that the knowledge preserved through his spiritual exile will benefit generations yet unborn. The hidden skills, the tactical wisdom, the moral understanding, all continue to evolve and adapt while maintaining their essential purpose of protecting the innocent from forces that would destroy everything worth preserving. Through this transmission of knowledge, the hero's shade achieved the only form of immortality that truly matters: the continuation of his ideals beyond his own existence. The profound sadness and ultimate beauty of the hero's shade's story remind us that the greatest heroes are often those whose sacrifices remain unwitnessed by history, whose struggles occur in solitude, whose victories serve others rather than themselves. His legend stands as eternal testament to the truth that heroism is not about personal glory, but about service to ideals greater than any individual life. Ideals worth preserving even when the cost extends beyond death itself into the realm of eternal duty.